The Ship of Theseus and the Sea of Names. When does understanding stop being neutral and begin to carry responsibility? If we clearly perceive a problem, what does that perception actually ask of us? I grew up around GEET, not as a concept, but as a presence. GEET, Global Environmental Energy Technology, is a fuel processing system and research pathway that points toward radically cleaner energy use, near zero emissions, and the possibility of addressing pollution, poverty, and resource-based conflict at their roots. From the beginning, I understood it that way. Long before formal language or public framing, it was already clear to me that this wasn't just a machine, it was something with implications. Some of my earliest memories are of watching my dad work, not in the sense of blueprints or equations, but in the sense of curiosity. He didn't treat problems as obstacles so much as invitations. And there is a phrase I remember clearly, verbatim, something he impressed on me very early. Anything you can imagine is possible, and any problem you face, you can solve. That idea wasn't abstract. It was practical. It shaped how I learned to stay with questions long enough for real understanding to emerge. When I was about 4 years old, I realized something that felt obvious to me at the time. What my dad had created behaved like a thunderstorm. Not noisy, not destructive, but alive, a system of forces interacting in balance. I remember thinking about calling it a thunderstorm generator and realizing the name didn't quite fit. It sounded chaotic, maybe even frightening. It didn't point toward what the system was actually doing. So I came up with another name, GEET, Global Environmental Energy Technology. At that age, I wasn't naming a product in the commercial sense. I was deliberately naming both a system and a direction, something meant to remain open, expansive, and capable of growing beyond any single configuration. That distinction was intentional from the start, and it has mattered ever since. As I grew older, I spent more time around the work, not trying to reinvent it, not trying to improve it in any dramatic way, but trying to understand it. And I learned something subtle and important. Understanding itself is rare. And there's a trap people fall into when they finally grasp something meaningful. The belief that understanding it means they must have understood it first, or better, or instead of the people who came before them. That mistake ruins more good work than ignorance ever could. Over time, I would ask questions or suggest directions that felt worth exploring. What if the rod had a concave end? What if the reactor could operate without relying on an engine, resulting in a furnace? What if excess fuel could power a separate, non-retrofitted engine, a servant engine? What if a rodless, Vajra-shaped configuration could be explored? Something scalable, something a person could even stand within, fully surrounded by the system's frequencies. What if simple elements like ceramic beads helped stabilize early experiments, even if they weren't strictly necessary long-term? I don't claim these as inventions. I never have. They were contributions in the truest sense of the word, observations, encouragements, and initiations of inquiry. Many of them were likely ideas my dad had already considered. What mattered wasn't authorship, it was momentum. One person doesn't have enough hours in a lifetime to explore everything alone. That was something my dad understood deeply. He had an unusual willingness to let people arrive at understanding for themselves. Even if he had already thought something through, he wouldn't rush to claim it. He wouldn't rain on the parade of discovery. He would simply nod, approve, and move forward together. That ethic shaped me more than any technical detail ever could. In 1998, we released GEET plans freely to the world for personal use. The decision to limit commercial use wasn't about control, it was about preventing capture, about keeping the work from being black-shelved, siloed, or bent into something that served only a few. It was a pay-it-forward model, grounded in the belief that if people truly understood the technology, they would also understand the responsibility that came with it. A new wave of free plans is now part of that same arc. Each time knowledge is shared openly, it attracts all kinds of people. Curious, inspired, cautious, ambitious. We're all in the same boat. The question is whether we move together. Over the years, people would often say things like, what your dad didn't understand about business was, or if it really worked, it would already be everywhere. Eventually, the same logic got applied to me. If your plan worked, it would have already happened. What those statements miss is something simple. Inspiration doesn't always mean replacement. Sometimes it means support. Many people who feel called toward this work aren't wrong, but that calling can be misinterpreted. Without realizing it, people step out of coordination and into competition, all while believing they're helping. They mistake understanding something for understanding it first, or worse, for needing to take it over. Understanding alone is gold. Believing you understand better or before others is where the punch bowl gets spoiled. Years ago at a conference, a GEET reactor, presented under another name, was brought over from overseas. The generator it was meant to run couldn't make the trip, so it had to be paired with equipment on site. The team that brought it wasn't able to get it working. Eventually, a group of GEET students and people familiar with the system stepped in, people who understood GEET not as a product, but as a process. Together, they got it running. Later, during that same conference, I had a private, candid conversation with the presenter, human to human. In that conversation, he expressed a real desire for transparency and a real discomfort with how difficult that transparency felt to practice. I didn't hear malice. I heard tension, the kind that arises when good intentions meet pressure. I understood that tension. Renaming technologies can sometimes feel like the only way forward, especially when suppression or resistance seems inevitable. But names matter. Names are how things survive in the sea of attention, but they can also be how they lose their bearings. When a single configuration is named as if it's the whole, it fragments research, confuses newcomers, and quietly erases the shared foundation everyone depends on. Anyone can name their own equipment. Like a boat, you can call it whatever you want. The problem only arises when the name implies authorship of the ocean. What matters isn't whether every plank is original, but whether the ship still knows which sea it's meant to cross. This is where stewardship enters the picture. Some people mistake optimism for arrogance, protectiveness for possessiveness. I understand why. In a culture that celebrates lone geniuses and quick wins, stewardship can look like control. But stewardship isn't ownership, it's responsibility. Power isn't taken by promises alone. Influence that isn't grounded in truth doesn't hold. Real influence is entrusted gradually by people who believe you're acting in good faith, with consistency, and with care. I didn't choose this role out of ambition. I stepped into it because I couldn't see how not to, because I was close enough to the work, early enough and long enough, to know how easily it could be misunderstood and how much was at stake if it was. The work now looks like a ship of Theseus. The original vessel no longer exists as a single intact thing. Planks are scattered, some are nearby, some are drifting, some don't yet fit. But the ship is rebuilt the same way it always has been, piece by people willing to align ethically and move together. All are welcome, so long as they meet that ethical baseline, understanding that meaningful contribution doesn't require being first, and responsibility doesn't require conquest. The reward isn't ownership. The reward is participation in something that lasts. If there's a path forward, it isn't through renegades or rebranding wars. It's through humility, coordination, and the simple recognition that understanding itself is already enough if we're willing to protect it together. That is the path I'm committed to. If what you've just heard resonates, there is a place to continue the conversation. GEET Club exists as a space for people who feel called to this work, not to claim it, not to rebrand it, but to understand it more deeply and help it move forward with care. You don't need to be an expert. You don't need to be first. You don't need to have the whole ship in your hands. What matters is curiosity, ethical alignment, and a willingness to move in coordination rather than competition. If that sounds like you, you're welcome to join. The link is here.